Adobe has announced Creative Suite 5.5, along with 3 companion apps for Photoshop CS5 software that are designed to help your creativity go mobile. Adobe Nav for Photoshop allows you to tap and swipe your iPad screen to activate Photoshop tools, browse open documents, and more. Adobe Eazel for Photoshop allows you to use your iPad canvas to create beautiful paintings, mixing and blending colors with wet and dry paint, and access them in Photoshop. Adobe Color Lava for Photoshop allows you to use your fingertips to mix colors on your iPad like a painter's palette to create custom color themes and swatches. These companion apps are designed to work right out of the box with Photoshop CS5 version 12.1, which comes with Creative Suite 5.5. For users using Photoshop CS5 version 12.0, which came with Creative Suite CS5, there's a free update to version 12.04, which is required to enable these companion apps to connect to Photoshop. The free 12.04 update for Photoshop CS5 is available through a software update you can install from Photoshop. The Adobe Photoshop Touch apps will be available through the Apple App Store. To install the required update for Photoshop CS5, launch Photoshop and choose Help Updates, which launches the Adobe Application Manager. Click Update to install the 12.04 update for Photoshop CS5. Enter your administrator username and password, if necessary, to finish the install. After you've installed the update, you can confirm that you have the 12.04 update by selecting About Photoshop from the Photoshop menu on Mac or from the Help menu on Windows. The version is displayed in the Photoshop splash screen. In order for the companion apps to connect to Photoshop, we need to first enable remote connections. In Photoshop, select Edit, Remote Connections to bring up the Remote Connections dialog. Enter a service name of your choice and create a password that is longer than 6 characters. Check the Enable Remote Connections checkbox and then click OK. Your companion apps can now connect to Photoshop using remote connections for as long as you keep Photoshop open and running. Once you've purchased and downloaded the companion apps from the Apple App Store and enabled remote connections in Photoshop, you can set up the connections between your iPad and Photoshop. We'll launch Adobe Nav for Photoshop. In the lower right-hand corner, there is a Photoshop icon, which is gray, to indicate it is not connected. Touch the Photoshop icon to bring up the Connections pop-up. Touch the service name you created and enter the password you created in the Remote Connections dialog in Photoshop. The Photoshop icon will change to blue and show the word Connected to indicate that the companion app is now connected to Photoshop. Touch the Full Screen button to cycle through the screen modes in Photoshop. Touch the Documents button at the bottom middle of the screen to bring up the Documents grid view. I have several documents open in Photoshop. Double tap an image to show the image's metadata information. Touch and hold an image to select and drag it to reorder the images. Pinch outward to zoom the image up to a large film strip view. Again, double tap the image to inspect the image's metadata information. Swipe side to side to view other images that are open in Photoshop. Pinch outward to zoom out to an even larger full screen view of the image. Swipe side to side to view other images. And pinch inward again to zoom back to the grid view of open documents. Swipe up and down to scroll through the grid view. Touch the empty grid square with a plus in the center of it to create a new document in Photoshop. Click the Tool button at the bottom of the screen to go back to Tool View. Touch the Screen Mode button to show the default screen mode in Photoshop. Touch any of the tools in the toolbar area to select a tool in Photoshop. Touch the Edit button in the lower left of the screen to customize the set of tools that are displayed. Click the X icon on Tools to remove them from the set of tools that are displayed. Touch and hold a tool from the list of available tools on the right to select and drag it to an empty slot in the tool grid. When finished, touch the Done button in the lower right. Next, we'll launch Adobe Color Lava for Photoshop to connect it to Photoshop. Touch the Photoshop icon to bring up the Connections pop-up. Touch the service name you created and enter the password you created in the Remote Connections dialog in Photoshop. You can pick up colors by touching the color wells in the color picker in the lower left of the screen and paint with the colors with your fingers on the canvas area. Pick up other colors and mix them together to create new colors. Touch a swatch on the right to select it, and touch a color on the canvas to set the swatch's color. Touching a swatch in the right-hand column sets the foreground color in Photoshop. Touch the New button in the lower left-hand corner to create a new color theme. Touch the Color Theme button in the middle of the bottom of the screen to see all your color themes. Double tap a color theme to see more details about the color theme, including the values for each color. Touch Send to Photoshop to send all the colors in the color theme to Photoshop Swatches panel. Touch Email to send the theme as well as the swatches preset that can be loaded into Photoshop to a client or colleague. Next, we'll launch Adobe Eazel for Photoshop. Touch the Eazel intro screen to begin. Note that Eazel's interface doesn't show the Photoshop icon for establishing connections by default. Touch the screen with all 5 fingers to bring up Eazel's interface controls. Lift all your fingers except for your pinky to activate Eazel's Connections UI. Touch the Photoshop icon to bring up the Connections pop-up. Touch the services name you want and enter the password you created in the Remote Connections dialog in Photoshop. Tap the screen to show all the UI. Tap again to hide the UI. Touch the screen with all 5 fingers. Lift all your fingers except for your index finger to bring up the Color Picker UI. Keeping your finger touched to the screen, drag down to select a color. You can now paint with your finger on the canvas. Note how the paint flows and swims as if it were wet. Touch the screen with all 5 fingers and select a new color. Paint some more with the new color. Notice how the colors mix and blend as if the paint were wet. Touch the screen with all 5 fingers again to bring up Eazel's interface controls. Then lift all your fingers except for your pinky to activate Eazel's Connections UI. Tap Transmit to Photoshop in the center of the screen to send the current painting to Photoshop. Tap Save to Photos to save the current painting to your Photos application on your iPad. Touch OK when Eazel confirms that your painting has been saved to Photos. To access help for connecting your Photoshop companion apps, touch the Photoshop icon and touch the word Help in the pop-up. This will bring up a visual help guide for establishing a connection to Photoshop from your companion app. Scroll to the bottom of the window to access a link to the online help guide for using each of the Photoshop companion apps. Visit our customer feedback portal at feedback.photoshop.com to make suggestions or ask questions about using any of the Photoshop companion apps.